All right, it's certainly a pleasure to be here with you today. I really want to thank Cassandra for having me. It's a wonderful class. It's a wonderful opportunity for you. I just wanted to let you know you have one of the leading ethnobotanists in the world teaching you. It's quite a privilege for you to have her as an instructor. Her work in Italy is absolutely fundamental in this field, and it's groundbreaking. Her work with Andrea Pieroni and peers such as that. I highly recommend that you actually, if you haven't, look into Dr. Cassandra's work in Italy. It's fascinating. I'm going to talk to you about Thailand from here on out. This lecture is going to be in the context of traditional Asian medicine. So I'm going to bring in a lot of other influences in traditional Thai medicine that come from other areas of Asia. The two major ones being Ayurvedic medicine from India and traditional Chinese medicine. I'd like to start this lecture with a dedication to a dear friend of mine that just passed away at the age of 88. He was one of the leading founders in the field of systems analysis, and very interesting guy, Dr. Frank Banghart. So this lecture is dedicated to him. I'd like to start with one quote from a very unique book called A Thai Herbal by a medical historian and herbalist named Pierce Salguero. It's one of the foremost American experts in traditional Thai medicine. He's in the University System of Pennsylvania now. This first quote comes from an ancient Thai saying, "All sickness begins in the diet." And traditional Thai medicine is focused on the diet as preventative and as an actual therapeutic modality. And it's much more, the nexus of the food and medicine is much tighter than we see even in the Indian systems of medicine or Chinese. And I'll go into some of the details of why that might be as we develop this. First thing I would like to begin with is a fundamental observation of the amount of horticultural research that's been going on practically in Southeast Asia for probably 20 to 30,000 years. Some ethnobotanists, like my colleague at Cornell, Dr. David Bates, thinks that the first medicines actually developed in Southeast Asia as they were using this traditional horticulture system of vegetative grafting of plants. They think that this is actually now the beginnings of agriculture, much older than planting seeds. So this comes from a wonderful book that was written in 1972. Our data has been certainly updated since then, but it certainly sets the groundwork for what we're talking about. So we can go back and look at pollen studies, and this book was saying then that that seed plants go back at least 9,000 years. Now we know it's much older than that, but we also know the vegetative method is much older, and it's much older than the seed method. And it's no way to track it really, because when you're vegetatively propagating crops, there's really no record like pollen or this other things you see with seeds. So the evidence is also overwhelming that this has been going on in Southeast Asia for millennium, well before seed agriculture. One of the really fascinating aspects when we started studying this medical ethnobotanically is to look at the use of something like the Zingiberaceae family. That's the ginger family. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about that, but the way it's used in Southeast Asia for traditional medicine really has a special place in Thai medicine especially. Just to give you some real quick facts on Thailand, kind of where it is and what it is. It's really literally the melting pot of Asia. There are loosely 5 or 6 defined regions that all have their own unique multi-ethnicities. Starting with the Deep South, which is primarily Muslim. It's the last bottom 4 provinces, and that changes from the rest of Thailand, which is primarily Buddhist. We also will see differences in foods and plant medicines based on the climate of the Deep South. The South itself is also tropical rainforest. Again, there's more mixture of cultures, more Buddhism and Islam mixed together, and those are the 2 primary religions that you see in Thailand, although you do see about 1% Christian, and you also see a great number of Sikhs and other Indian religions. The stated population is about 64 million. When you actually factor in undocumented workers coming in from places like Burma and Laos, it's probably closer to 75 million. And we're talking about Metro Bangkok, which is a stated population of 8 to 9 million. It's probably more like 12 to 14, given the undocumented workers. The Thailand's roughly the size of France and Texas. It has 72 provinces, many dialects. 42% of the people are employed in agriculture. It's primarily an agricultural nation. It's the only nation in Southeast Asia that exports food. It's the leading exporter of rice. And it has, I think this 42% employed in agriculture really also is linked to the incredible fascinations the Thais have with food. It has really become an art and science with them. So as we look at the evolution of the human diet, early human diets were out foraging. We're eating really what we can find. We're eating a lot of plants. Maybe some estimates say 80 to 225 species of plant in weekly and monthly consumption patterns. Your diet's really going to evolve from the ecological niche in which you are located and the trade routes that are bringing products to and through where you live. So in Southeast Asia, we see this great variety of different plant foods and medicines that are based on some of these factors. Traditional Mediterranean diet, and when we really start looking at specific areas, we can really pinpoint some very effective therapeutic tools when we're looking in these areas of functional medicinal foods. Sardinians live to be among the oldest people in the world, and that's certainly an ideal Mediterranean diet, and it's a fascinating place to study. There's a lot of people in this field now in Sardinia studying it. Asia itself, of course, also. The Okinawans and the Japanese generally are the oldest living people in the world. When we actually start looking in detail at the diet itself, from a medical ethnobotanical standpoint and ethnopharmacy standpoint, we really can start getting therapeutic data when we look at the subtleties of the culture. And this is why it's so important to have informants and to actually have a very in-depth understanding of the cultures that you're studying. Just to give you, for instance, in traditional Japanese diets, when we look, they're among the most healthy in the world. They have among the lowest incidences of chronic disease and live to be the oldest in the world as a people. When we look at Okinawa, it's even more so. So when we specifically look at the diet, they have a much greater use of spices. This is probably due to the geography. It's southernly located right at the end of where the spice routes were ending. The other thing is they widely consume purple sweet potatoes, which are full of phytochemicals called anthocyanins, which are very cardioprotective, have a lot of other health benefits. And they also widely consume bitter melon, as you might have read in one of your reading assignments that I left for you. We're going to explore how the Thais use that bitter melon a little bit later. Now, specifically to focus on the genius of the traditional Thai diet. Where you go in Thailand really depends on what you're going to eat. There's a lot of variety in the food, and it's hard to describe. You might have been to Thai restaurants here. There's no way to even to describe how that doesn't compare to what it tastes like in Thailand and how it's regionally based and locally and sustainably harvested and collected and cooked every day fresh. Thai curries are wet curries, fresh spices. These spices are compounded extemporaneously right before you make the curry, so they're fresh. So it's a different phytochemistry, and it's a different taste than you get in Indian curries, which are dry spices. And so we start looking at some of the translation in translational medicine, some of the aspects of what does this mean, wet versus dry curries. When is it, in traditional Thai medicine, there's very specific recipes on how you make these curries. You have to make them in a certain order. You have to grind these constituent spices a certain way for a certain amount of time. It's really an art, and it really takes a long time to make a traditional Thai curry correctly. Traditional Thai diet has among the very highest intake and variety of vegetables and fruits in the world. The Thais have among the lowest incidence of chronic diseases in the world, the lowest rates of cancer, with the exception of gastric cancer and liver cancer that they can tie to direct vectors like liver flukes. So it is, in essence, it's an anti-cancer diet. When we start looking at the different regions, again, based on the niche construction of the ecology of where the climate and the culture have co-evolved with the plants and the people, we find the bases of these curries, the vegetable oil bases in the north, based on the vegetables that they usually use. In the central, coconuts are everywhere. So coconut oil base we see in the curries in central Thailand. Coconut oil is showing a lot of incredible health properties now. So when I actually get into the construction of a curry, I'm going to show you how it is many, many different drugs at very low doses put together in a food that you're eating as a preventative or a actual medicinal food. a functional food or medicinal food. In the South, look at the variation here now. They use turmeric paste instead of the coconut oil, or they use ghee, and this is based on a lot of Indian migration into the area. And the turmeric comes from the geography of the area. Now, just to give you some idea of why the Thai diet, why my colleagues and I and our research is based on the premise that the biodiversity of the Thai diet has a lot to do with its health benefits and its preventive medicine aspects. So again, as I was saying earlier, early human diets were in between 80 and 225 plant-based foods. And this is translated to a weekly or monthly consumption pattern of 100 to 200,000 dietary phytochemicals. Why is it significant when we start looking at functional phytochemicals? What we know in comparison to what these plants make is just, it's infinitesimal. We're just getting started in this. We're like babies. So we know of 189,000 pharmacologically active natural products. Most of these are phytochemicals. Phytochemicals have been evaluated for 3 or more activities and over 50,000 phytochemicals. They certainly have much more than 3 bioactivities. It's just that's what has been measured. Each plant probably contains somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 phytochemicals. Our best characterized ones are only maybe in the nature of 1,000 to 1,500, maybe 2,000, and very well characterized mints or something like that. So the significance we see is this lack of chronic disease in early man in this plant-based diet. The modern Western diet being very lenient, giving them 25,000 phytochemicals a week to a month in the modern Western diet. Well, you know, the modern Western diet for most Americans is maybe 2 vegetables, so it'd be about 10,000. That's counting potatoes as a vegetable. Luckily, a lot of this is people are becoming more aware, and we're starting to learn about these traditional diets and how to use these foods. And so people are starting to eat more healthy in America. The real key in the future of therapeutics, and pay attention to this because this is really going to change medicine once we can figure this out. It's going to be the epigenetic health modifiers. So these dietary phytochemicals, one of the theories is that their health benefits come from constantly changing the epigenome to keep you in homeostasis. Whereas opposed to what we're finding with single molecular entities, prescription drugs, in all likelihood, all these side effects you're seeing from drugs are to a major extent epigenetically induced. And so over time, you actually see it. Maybe you even start seeing it in future generations. This is a whole new field in pharmacovigilance. So the history of medical ethnobotany and ethnopharmacy, ancient to modern. I'm going to make this a real brief thumbnail sketch. So we started using plants as hunters and gatherers, wildly collecting them. Gardening and horticulture took on many different forms. As we see in Asia, primarily it started as a propagation, not seed-based. Traditional Asian medical systems have developed very sophisticated systems of looking at how to use these plants with their own pharmacologies, from traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine in India, Uani Tib in Pakistan and other places of the Islamic world. So you're talking about people that are using traditional medical systems with populations of 300 to 1.5 billion people. These systems have incredible amounts of subtlety, and they have been used 5,000 years experimentally. We have a lot of data. We know a lot of these things work different ways, and now we're starting to apply our Western biomedicine integratively to come up with paradigms to how to use it here in America complementary. So, along with the fact that I just stated about these traditional medical systems and these populations, we see 80% of the world uses food and medicinal plants as their primary care. A lot of them, that's all they have, those poor people. They only have plants that are safe and a lot of times make them better instead of the drugs that we have with all the side effects. It's a quote from my old buddy Jim Duke. He says it quite often. So within the context of Asia, this is in Beijing. That is actually the gateway to the functional food treasure land of Asia. I was actually lucky enough to take a picture of the gateway. And this is rush hour at Danoam Sarawak. It's the main floating market in Thailand. This has been used for over 1,000 years to move plants all the way from the north of Thailand through canals for this incredible market. This is a Saturday market. Yes, there are some tourists there, but even 400 years ago it looked like this. It's a main trading crossroads in Southeast Asia. This is actually my niece right here, and this is my wife, and you can't see, but I'm reaching over here trying to get one of these bananas a little farther back. So traditional Thai medicine has evolved its own system, and it was already sophisticated, and it was very much based on the diet. Then Thai culture is primarily influenced from India as far as the language, the names, the literature, which is kind of interesting. So certainly the medical system is primarily based on Ayurveda. To give you some examples of how the Thais actually use it, the cultural hybridization to make it their own is traditional Ayurvedic medicine has between 10 and 14 tastes, and traditional Thai medicine can have between 11 and 20. And traditional Thai medicine can use 20 to 30 spices in just a normal curry. Their traditional herbal medicines will sometimes use over 100 different combinations of plants based on their phytochemistry within the traditional Thai tradition. I'll speak on that in a little more detail to tell you exactly what I'm talking about there. So in the Ayurvedic system, we see spices are a primary therapeutic factor as foods and as medicines, and especially in Thailand even more so. So we've already gone over how the spices are used differently in the Ayurvedic traditions of traditional Thai medicine and Indian Ayurvedic. As we pay more attention to these functional aspects, we're actually beginning to see some incredible things. The NIH right now is doing a multi-collaborative project across the world through about 4 or 5 different countries. They're going to take 1 million patients in India that daily consume this turmeric and these other spices and track them for a number of years for specific cancers. Over 1 million people. So we're really going to get some, I believe, incredible chemoprevention data on how to use spices to prevent and treat and cure cancer. This is one of the leading ones right here, turmeric, curcumin, the curcuminoids, all these compounds related. Turmeric has many more compounds. It has gingerols, it has chalcones. The Zingiberaceae family has all these different compounds that are all doing different activities that are beneficial. We'll go into more detail on that later, but curcumin itself, pay particular attention to this because this is really the most promising area in cancer chemoprevention and chemotherapy right now. Several clinical trials going on at 1, 2, and 3 stages for different cancers. There's been great deal of efficacy shown in using turmeric powder to prevent and reverse colon cancer in humans. So certainly it's one of our most promising areas. A real quick nod to traditional Chinese medicine and its influence in traditional Thai medicine, and it's definitely where the food comes in. So like I said, Thailand is such a melting pot. You'll have in one street, you'll have an Indian pharmacy, a Chinese pharmacy, a traditional Chinese pharmacy, and a big Western chain pharmacy, all in the same street. It's kind of fascinating. That's one thing I take my students and show them all the different pharmacies in one street in downtown Bangkok. So that's a pretty amazing thing where you actually see them practicing their traditions, millennial traditions, side by side. So traditional Chinese medicine, they actually really started this field of the materia medica for diet therapy. They started diet therapy. They started recipes where they would, again, this is a 5,000-year-old continuous tradition of history, oral history, and written history. So what that means is they would keep adding recipes and they'd keep doing experiments. This guy here, Lai Shizhen, wrote the Bing Gang Gao Mu, the great herbal of China. It was his lifetime work. It took him 50 years to compile it. It was published after his death. It addressed 1,900 plants, and it addressed the history and the ethnobotany of China up until that time. Lai Shizhen was a very well-traveled medical ethnobotanist within the Chinese tradition. Just to give you an example of his food recipes that are medicinal, in his Materia Medica for Diet Therapy chapter in this herbal, he had 12 traditional recipes and 20 that he actually invented himself through doing the experiments. These are medicinal uses of chives, Chinese chives, which now that we get them in the lab, we show these are other very potent anti-cancer compounds in these chives. And they're in the allium family, which we also see sulfa compounds from garlic and from onions that are also doing the same thing. So the unique aspect of traditional Thai medicine, and it's quite enjoyable to do this research, is how they have made just this art and science of the phytochemistry of taste. And after years of research, after 18 years of research, and the last 12 years going to Thailand for 1 to 2 months every year, traveling in approximately 54, 55 of the 72 provinces, I've never ceased to be astounded at the subtlety and the genius of the science of traditional Thai medicine, especially as it starts with the food and the diet, the dietary patterns, and how these are put together. And it even gets more subtle and more complex than that. Just to quickly go through this, the traditional Thai medicine is a complete holistic, standalone, functional way of health and wellness that the Thais use daily in their routine. They walk to the market every day at least a mile or two, get their fresh produce, their vegetables, and then walk back and cook it. So they're also incorporating the holistic aspect of exercise. They're also socializing. So it's a whole way of life, really. Health is multifactorial, and so is disease. Just keep that in mind as we look at this. So these delicious flavors and spices of traditional Thai cuisine evolved from a food medicine nexus to be a preventive medicine system. You're actually tasting the taste of health when you taste Thai food. It's been designed so that this delicious taste means you are actually preventing chronic diseases. For instance, the spice mixture combinations they put together. I said 20 to 30 to 100 different combinations of plant parts. These spices themselves each have there's multifarious constituents. Each spice 5 to 10,000 components maybe. Each particular phytochemical, like curcumin itself, has pleiotropic bioactivities that modulate health and disease. Pleiotropic means many different activities that are expressed different ways. Again, it's the taste of health. So my particular focus in looking at this area is to look at it from the standpoint of what's loosely defined as ethnopharmacy. And just to really basically sum that up, it's looking at cultural history of medicinal plant use within communities, taking all our Western biomedical science techniques and all the areas of pharmacy, trying to bring them together for sustainable development and to help traditional people in their health care, looking at the safety of their herbs. For instance, you might have noticed in the one article how they were looking at fungal levels in herbal medicines in Thailand. So that's one of the things that ethnopharmacy is doing. But the area for me that really finds so much interest, this is an area Dr. Cassandra has done a lot of work in, and I myself from the Thai standpoint have also, and that's the ethnopharmacy of food. And the ethnopharmacy of food is looking at the aspects of food that are actually pharmacological, foods that are medicines. So we look at functional food science and nutrigenomics. Nutrigenomics means we're actually looking at how the genome and the epigenome are actually affected by these dietary patterns. We can look at it in real time, over seconds, weeks, days. The goals of the ethnopharmacy of food are to take these traditional dietary patterns, preparation techniques, and develop modalities and therapeutic agents that can be used globally in chronic disease all over the world, not just in populations where you see these blue zones, so to speak. Blue zones are areas where the people live to be very old, don't have chronic disease, and die of old age with a very contented life, still working up into the hundreds in some cases. So as we look at the movement of the plants into Thailand, we see it's been such a crossroad of areas. And what we don't realize through history, when you start looking at the history of the spice movement especially, you have something like the Arabs were trading spices in the Sukhothai kingdom 400 or 500 years before the Uyghur kingdom formed here in this central area. By that time, And the Islamic trading world was primarily the drug movement world. They invented pharmacology. So they also had these moving hakims who were also moving the knowledge of how to use these plants. The Persians took this over 400 years later, and we find them in a UTI in the court, trying to get trade concessions for a lot of these spices. For ones that come from Persia, like you see, uniquely in the Thai diet with all the other spices like saffron. Saffron's one. Another one that kind of came out of this area, it came out of Southeast Asia, was a cardamom, a white cardamom. It came into Thailand. They uniquely developed it up in this area. It's unique in the world. It's incredibly fragrant. We haven't gotten it into the lab yet to look at it. But one thing that you see in areas of Thailand or anywhere where they have a product so great like that, they tend to hide it and keep it secret. For instance, in Hawaii, they have a very delicious pineapple, but it never gets off the Big Island. So when I was there in the Big Island one time, I'm like, wow, I've never had a pineapple this delicious from Hawaii. And they go, yeah, because it never gets off the island, that's why. So when you go somewhere, ask around. Cuisine construction. As we look at the subtlety of the medical ethnobotany and ethnopharmacy of traditional Thai functional foods and medicinal foods and phytomedicines, there's a lot in the actual construction of the cuisine, the art and science that dictates health effects. Such things as probiotics and prebiotics in traditional fermented functional foods. These foods, through great deals, periods of time, have been developed where they actually change the GI microbiome. The bacteria in your gut, which is a whole ecology by itself, and has tremendous health effects. We're just starting to learn about this. They've been using these traditional fermented foods to change this GI microbiome. One thing this does is it makes the foods you eat much more bioavailable for the nutrition and the other beneficial dietary phytochemicals. This is an area that really we need to start looking in more detail. I think there's a lot of promise here in traditional diets to translate into American dietary therapy. Give you a couple examples from other traditions. Aged garlic extract in Korea shows much more bioactivity against cancer than garlic itself, and they ferment it for 40 days, it becomes black. And that changes the phytochemistry itself. This is a traditional method developed in Korea over thousands of years. Miso soup in Japan, very well-known functional food, very nutritious probiotic that's now in mainstream cuisines all over the world. The fermented foods in Thailand are there is just literally almost an infinite variety in number, from fermented tofu to durian paste. I don't know if anyone here has ever heard of durian or tasted a durian. A durian, by definition itself, is already kind of a stinking sulfa mess. They won't let you bring it in hotels. They won't let you put it on trains. They will actually fine you if you try to bring it into your hotel room. So a durian paste is actually a fermented durian product, if you can believe it. And I almost brought some, but there's a lot of issues with that. Anyway, the paste is not near as, it's kind of like banana bread, how you take rotten bananas and you make them into something you can eat that's not that bad. That's how this paste is. And just to give you a real quick story, I went down to the south of Thailand after the tsunami to the other end because, as you might well know, the west was pretty much, the western southern end of Thailand was shut off. On the eastern end, there's the second biggest island is called Koh Chang. It's primarily 90% rainforest. My wife and her sister collect orchids all over Southeast Asia, so they've dragged me all over Southeast Asia to find orchids. We went to this one orchid farmer on this island, and his wife was making this paste. This is the first time I'd seen it, and she made it in a tub about this big. It's probably 100 kilos of durian paste. And so I looked at it, I said, what is it? It looks kind of like a taffy. He says, well, she'll give you a taste. My wife said, ask her. So she gave me a taste. I said, wow, give me about 5 kilos. You know, she looked at me because, you know, for a Westerner, that's not much. For a Thai, it'd be pretty expensive. So I took my 5 kilos. I started eating this durian paste. Later on, I found I could eat anything off the street. I never got the diarrhea that I'd always get when I came to Southeast Asia. So the first thing I do now is I make a beeline to Koh Chang. I get a specific durian paste from this lady, and then I'm good to go. It's kind of just a kind of an interesting sideline story there. Traditional Thai dishes, the condiments themselves are very specific to the dish. And the condiments are, again, multi-constituent. It's spices and it's coconut oil and coconut vinegar and just an infinite variety of things. There are also specific aspects of how they prepare the food that make it more healthy. For instance, you'll see peanuts a lot in a lot of Thai dishes, especially in pasta dishes. What we've now found is putting peanuts in pasta dishes, and if you put soy in there also with an omega-3 source like fish or free-range chicken in Thailand, which has a high amount of omega-3 because it literally is running around eating off the ground, you increase the level of omega-3s because of the soy, and the peanuts decrease the glycemic load of the pasta. So you can eat more pasta and get a lower glycemic load. So for diabetics, this might be an important factor to look at incorporating into their diet. Stir frying, which is a well-known technique in Asia, and Thailand is traditionally used quite a bit in vegetables. So it's quickly for short periods of time, therefore less of the nutrients are cooked out. There's very specific methods. Again, I've gone over the curries, and it's just kind of reiterating, yeah, these are wet curries also in Thailand. They put a lot of liquid into them with the rice. Speaking of rice, another real quick aside in traditional Thai ethnobotany. The Thais became real prosperous, and they decided to eat white rice, where you polish all the nutrients out of it. So they have this red rice, which is very nutritious. The red actually means something. It's telling you something about the phytochemistry that's beneficial. The carotenoid content's very high in this red rice. Well, they started giving the red rice to the prisoners, and they noticed the prisoners didn't get sick. So they finally pinpointed that, and now the red rice is much more expensive than it was previously. It was prisoner food. So how can we actually start looking at how to use this therapeutically in America? These different foods, food patterns, and these different ways of preparing foods. I'm not going to go over into all the details. This is kind of in America what functional food, nutrition therapy, and pharmaconutrition looks like. They have these entities called medical foods and dietary supplements, which are not really tested. They're just kind of a marketing product for the most part. And they're not really near as effective as medicinal and functional foods that are from whole plants. The data again and again shows us out. Epidemiologically in clinical trials, we know this is the case. It's just a matter of getting other paradigms changed. So as you can see, this is a really, really interesting and confusing area, the food medicine continuum, and the areas that are functional foods that come from the areas of medical sciences, food sciences, and nutrition. Traditional functional food is essentially a food that has health benefit beyond its basic nutrition. It has chemicals in there to do other things for health benefit. Medicinal foods are actually treating specifically a medical condition based on that specific food. So when we start looking at how you actually prepare your food, we look in traditional Thai methods, and we see you're actually taking carcinogens out of your foods, what you see in meats that are cooked at high temperatures. You see these heterocyclic amines that are known carcinogens. So so-called primitive food techniques, such as just even from Western and Mediterranean traditions, all of these different agents were tried and found to greatly reduce the formation of these heterocyclic amines. This right here is crotchai. I'm first mentioning it. I'm going to go ahead and pass it around. This is crotchai, powdered crotchai. It's from the ginger family. It's very specific. It's also known as Chinese key or Thai finger root. It's used in a lot of traditional Thai ways, and I'll detail that in a minute. And again, another quote from Pierre Salguero, and this is actually from him, not the Thai tradition. After many years of study, he came to the conclusion, in traditional Thai medicine, almost every dish is considered therapeutic. Wow, wow, that's really a preventive medicine system, isn't it? When every dish is therapeutic. So when we look at traditional Thai cuisine, it's a mixture of very many different phytochemicals in the forms of a great deal number of spices, herbs, vegetables, and tropical fruits. I think probably the Thai diet has the highest number of different tropical fruits and vegetables than anywhere else in the world. Mainly because the Thais are such fanatics about eating. Every year when I watch TV, somebody's died from trying something they shouldn't. So it's definitely practical pharmacology. Other aspects of this, Usually if you do see protein sources, it's tofu or soy-based or seafood. They also eat a lot of chicken, and it's all organic and free range. They don't eat much red meat at all. The Chinese eat a lot of pork. The Chinese population is about 15% in Thailand. The order of the food consumed has traditional dietetic functions. Here we get into more subtlety. The order, the chronobiology of when you eat, how you prepare it, the order of the foods that are eating. For instance, when you're eating mangosteen and durian, traditionally when you eat durian, if you're eating it for health in Thailand, the durian is considered a hot food, and I'm sure it's killing bacteria. I think it's probably effective against H. pylori, just based on my own experience with durian over the years. But then they follow it within 30 minutes with mangosteen. Mangosteen is another fruit, very delicious, called the queen of the fruits in Thailand. They found a compound primarily concentrated in these holes called mangosteen. It is the world's most potent anti-inflammatory found so far to date. So you have an anti-inflammatory food following this incredible antibacterial food. They're taking this kind of yin and yang. The mangosteen is known as cooling. So it's to offset the heating aspect of the durian. Another aspect of this incredible traditional knowledge that we have in Thailand and other places of the world with these cultures is that we're losing this knowledge very fast as urbanization occurs, as globalization, as homogenization of cultures. This is a very quick example of that. Noel Johnson was doing research with the Karen tribe in northern Thailand. There's a very nice 5-star hotel in the Karen section of northern Thailand. The Karens are a very interesting tribe. There are about 500,000 people living on the border of Thailand and Burma, and they've had quite a rough time for 50 years since the British left. But they're tremendous stewards, and they have tremendous knowledge of the forest for food plants, for medicinal plants, and for healing. So when Noel Johnson was doing a research, she found 50 edible wild species in the area that had been confirmed from Karen traditions. Out of these 50 species, 31 had significantly declined in use over 10 years. 7 had locally become extinct. Only 17 were locally cultivated in the household gardens. Dr. Johnson came to the conclusion that her most important finding was a redefinition of the word extinction. It's an extinction of knowledge of how to use those plants. This is a very crucial area in ethnobotany, and I'm sure Cassandra will go in much more detail about this with you. It's really an important thing. There's a lot of reasons for the loss of this traditional knowledge. This is the long-necked Karen tribe up in the Shan states of Burma, up in the northern border of Thailand. The Shan states are in the Golden Triangle, very famous for heroin production, opium poppy. This is really like the wild, wild west. These people are still trying to hang on their traditions and live traditionally in kind of a reservation-like situation, surrounded by these poppy fields in the Golden Triangle of Thailand. That's one example. Okay, now I'm going to pass around, this is hibiscus tea. It comes from the actual calyx. This is a traditional Thai beverage. This is an amazing beverage. This beverage itself could probably treat mild to moderate hypertension just by itself. You make a tea out of these calyces. You take about one of those and put it in a pot of water and make a cup of tea. The Thais drink it all day. They drink it as iced tea or they drink it as hot tea. Usually hot tea in the morning and then iced tea as it gets warmer. And the morning being literally 4:30, 5 o'clock before the sun comes up. So what does this do? Well, we already know, looking at hibiscus in the lab, it has chemical compounds that are ACE inhibitors, that are diuretics, has cardiovascular activity. It's antihypertensive, it's a diuretic, it lowers cholesterol, that non-beneficial cholesterol. National standard rates it as a grade B antihypertensive. It clinically reduces systolic and diastolic hypertension in mild to moderate cases. One study found it essentially effective, equivalently effective to captopril, a blood pressure medicine that's widely prescribed. Traditional Thai medicine, this tea is used as a general tonic for good health. It's also specifically used for gout, and it's used for renal stones. And it's actually been shown in Thai studies, they've looked in their own systems to be effective in those areas. This is tulsi. This is a holy plant in India and in Thailand. It's an incredible tea. They use it in the food. This is what's called an adaptogen. An adaptogen in herbal terms means that this plant is going to do what your body needs to do to put it in balance. And when I go over its immune modulation, we'll talk about that a little more. I'm not going to go to a whole lot of detail about habitat or phytochemistry. I do want to talk specifically about the medical ethnobotany, though, because now we're looking at functions. In Ayurveda, it's used as a demulcent, which means it thins secretions. It's used as a diaphoretic. It means to make you sweat, to get rid of fevers. Expectorant, to cough up secretions you might have. Insecticide, antihelminthic, to kill worms. It's used as a laxative, cardiotonic, blood purifier. It's used in hepatic disorders. The oil's applied externally to ulcers. And so as we look at the phytochemistry, we can look at specific compounds and specific activities. These terpenes, terpenes are acids that we see here. They have these steroidal-like functionality. These phenols here, we know those are going to be antibacterial. We know the steroid moieties are going to be anti-inflammatory. We can get to specific things. We start looking at like rosmarinic acid as a flavonoid. And as we look at the specific activities, we can see specific compounds are immunomodulatory, antiviral, anti-allergy, antibacterial, hypoglycemic, et cetera, et cetera. Carvacrol, we've seen a lot of activities from those. The rosmarinic acid is a very highly effective anti-inflammatory compound. Might you guess what other plant you can find rosmarinic acid in high amounts? Anyone hazard a guess? Very good. Wow. Okay, y'all get 100 today. That was a test question. So, Tulsi, let's look at it. What is it actually doing here? Adaptogen regulates HPA axis. This is Western biomedicine translation of what Tulsi's doing, okay? So it's regulating stress. It's helping you relieve stress in your daily activity. Your immune system, if you're having excessive immune response, it downregulates it. While it also promotes immune competence. That means if your immune system is too weak, it will actually bring it up into homeostasis. It enhances cerebral circulation and memory. This is really interesting. In traditional Ayurvedic medicine, it's given to clear the mental fogging of hashish use. So there's been a large clinical trials going on for years in India, practically, for the use of Tulsi as to clear up the brain fog of cannabis use. It lowers blood sugar levels. It can be used in combination with other agents to treat diabetes, totally with food by itself, without using medicines. It's actually used in India as an antiviral encephalitis agent. It's used to treat encephalitis. And it reduces stress-induced hypertension. Now we're going to really look at bitter melon in a little more detail as a very viable medicinal food to prevent and treat type 2 diabetes. Look at the statistics in America. Diabetes affects 20 million known patients, probably another 20 million pre-diabetic or undiagnosed. It's not treated very well. It's a $137 billion a year problem. 93 billion spent on drugs. So if we can use bitter melon instead of drugs, look at the cost savings right there. The drug companies aren't going to be too happy with that, but maybe they can find something to patent bitter melon with. So diabetes is a disease of inflammation, obesity, and insulin resistant. It has high risk for cardiovascular disease. Most people die from cardiovascular disease before they die from the diabetes. Bitter melon is a very interesting plant. It is very, very bitter, hence the name. It's in the Cucurbitaceae family, which is the cucumber family. It's used traditionally in China, India, and Southeast Asia to treat type 2 diabetes. There's a drink called bitter melon drink. It actually has a plant insulin. It secretes insulinomimetic lectins. Here I actually have a plant insulin. We look at the pharmacology. We see that plant insulin reduces blood glucose levels. These other compounds here have hypoglycemic effects, and Vicin itself actually inhibits glucose absorption. So you have in this plant at least 3 known different mechanisms of actions by which it's preventing and helping to treat diabetes. The difference between a conventional drug and this plant is a conventional drug would have one that's highly concentrated at one target, which the body can't really recognize, and therefore it's going to cause side effects. And the real problem is the epigenetic side effects we see down the road. So how does this translate? The phytotherapeutic aspects of using bitter melon as a whole food are It reduces blood sugar, improves glucose tolerance, reduces hemoglobin A1C. This is the biomarker that we use to see the effectiveness of drugs. I am sure when we get in the lab and we start using all of these agents in combination, these spices, these curries, bitter melon, this tulsi, we can bring the hemoglobin A1C down much more than the drugs. The drugs will only bring it down 2 points. So if you have a hemoglobin A1C of 11, the drugs aren't going to bring you to a target of 6, which is what most targets are for healthy individuals. With foods, perhaps. It's also antiviral, and again, this is another agent that probably inhibits H. pylori. It's used in traditional, this is actually Indian bitter melon here. It's a little bit different. Phytochemistry similar. The other bitter melon is the one you see in Thailand, this one. It's used traditionally as a vegetable, ubiquitously, almost every day. It's also seen as a medicine. So ginger itself, there's just one real quick recipe, the ginger tea in Thailand. They take a 10 mLs of ginseng, ginger and galangal, a fourth of lemon, 15 mLs of bee or pollen honey or bee pollen. It's used to treat all these different diseases, including this aphrodisiac, which is probably has something to do with the ginseng, but could also be the ginger and galangal because they thin the blood. So we see the ginger family here. I was talking about all these incredible uses in traditional Southeast Asia. This goes to the, here's crotchai again, and we see all these different uses. It's used in cuisine as a digestive aid. It's used in medicine for anti-inflammation and as a diuretic. It's also used in cases of food poisoning. And again, in the West, we're starting to use it to decrease cancer. Curcumin, I've already talked about it, turmeric. These are all, just to very briefly, these are all the different pathways that we know just on nuclear factor kappa B that it modulates to decrease cancer. There's about 5 different ways it actually works on cancer. Ginger, there's one thing about ginger. I always recommend to patients ginger for colds. Why? It contains this compound zingiberine. 35% of the essential oil is zingiberine. It inhibits rhinovirus. It will actually cure cold. It'll speed it up the resolution. There's a lot of other pharmacological activity in ginger that will help treat colds and do a lot of other things like prevent cancer. Chili peppers themselves have been found to be thermogenic agents. When you look at the actual, when we're looking at the nutrition content, 2 times the amount of vitamin C found in the red chili peppers, 9 times the amount of vitamin A. As you get hotter with it, you get more of this vitamin C. And so we see in the pure capsaicin up to 16 million Scoville units. That would literally burn a hole through you. And just to give you some example of what that means, one more brief statement. The quercetin is a COX-2 inhibitor. It's the most potent plant-based COX-2 inhibitor. This is the same thing you see in your non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. But this also has a lot of anti-cancer activity. One more real interesting point to make about chili peppers is it's thermogenic and anti-angiogenic. That means it helps you metabolism speed up, burn fat, and it helps you decrease blood vessel growth so that the fat adipose cells can't anastomatize and grow. So it's an excellent anti-obesity agent. They're starting to look at that. So I always get the question, well, how much do I eat, you know? And it all comes down to your individual phytochemistry. You'll know when you have enough. But you should try to incorporate it every day into your diet with these other spices. And so this is how it translates. These are the Thai chilies. Do not touch those. Scoville units of green bell pepper, 0. When we look over at Thai and the habaneros, that's when we see you crying here. It's 50,000 to 100,000 usually in Thai chilies and 100,000 to 500,000 in habaneros. If you're familiar with chilies, you'll know about what that means. There are Thai chilies that are at least 500,000. These are probably 250,000 here, these ones going around the room. So in conclusion, I just have a very brief statement to make that a colleague of mine turned me on to, which I think is very much cogent to this situation, kind of sums up everything. Our future medicines, especially for chronic disease, perhaps will be multi-component phytochemical mixtures that resemble good quality food, such as Thai food. This is Dr. Kevin Spellman. That's a colleague of mine, an absolutely brilliant phytotherapist. He's the principal scientist at Herb Farm for Ed Smith's Herbs up in Oregon. He's a very interesting guy. I'd like to just briefly have some acknowledgments here. A big thank you, molto grazie, to my colleague and medical ethnobotany mentor, Cassandra. A great deal of thanks to my department head and the dean and the vice chair of the Department of Pharmacy Practice at Mercer's has supported me in what they call this, excuse the language, this crazy shit over all these years. For pharmacy, this is really something out of the box, so to speak. As a matter of fact, they keep me in a very secluded area and tell me to be very quiet. My major mentor in medical ethnobotany, Dr. Eloy Rodriguez at Cornell University, is currently having health issues himself, and I've got him on bentermelin. He's got type 2 diabetes. Jim Revelle, Dr. David Bates, other ethnobotanist and historical botanist at Cornell. John Milner at the NIH, who's doing a lot of this very forefront work on using dietary phytochemicals to prevent cancer. Dr. Jim Duke, just Google him up. That's all I can say. Cassandra can confirm. He's unique in the world, the barefoot doctor. Kevin Spellman, Dennis McKenna, my ethnopharmacology professor at the University of Minnesota. Kat Harrison, my ethnobotany professor. My nephew, Jonathan Baker, for help with graphics, helping his old uncle actually put a PowerPoint together. And my brother-in-law, Wolfgang Hasper, for computer help. Above all, very special thanks to my wife for tolerating a lot of time I'm not home working on these projects. Thank you.